Hi, everybody. Christine Gillespie here. I am the Retail and Tourism Manager at Historic Huguenot Street. And one of the many digital programs that we've been offering online is a weekly reading of excerpts or portions of one of the books that we sell in our museum shop. Today's book is going to be New York Votes for Women, a Suffrage Centennial Anthology. And this is actually edited by Stacey Murphy and Nora Snyder. In New York Votes for Women, a women's suffrage centennial anthology, 21 women explore questions in a variety of engaging memoirs, stories, and poems. They will leave you with fresh ideas about what the inspiring past implies for our uncertain future. And I just want to let everybody know that next week we'll be having a live reading of excerpts from the book with the women who wrote them. Tune in on June 10th at 7 p.m. For more information, the link to register will be in the post following the video. And if you'd like to purchase the book ahead of time to read along with the live reading, we are more than happy to get the book shipped out to you ASAP. One of the cool things about this book that I like, that I wanted to share with you guys before we started, is that this book is made up of different writings from various women from all over. So it's really cool that each section that you get to has a different feel and different dynamic and covers different topics and issues. So I do really like that about this book. I'm only going to read a couple of excerpts because we will be featuring a number of the speakers during the live reading next week. So I hope you guys enjoy the ones that I picked. And like I said, if you're interested in purchasing the book, follow all the information in this post. So I want to start with, as always, the table of contents. So you can see it shows you each section is a different author or person, and that's how it's organized, which is nice. So if you know the author that you would like to look for, you can skip right ahead. Otherwise, you can peruse through. I did want to read a little bit from the introduction for you guys. So this is written by one of the editors, Nora Snyder, and here we go. I've long enjoyed history, especially learning about the things that weren't taught in classes or history books. Everything that has ever happened to people when placed against the backdrop of the times they lived in becomes social history. And when told well, who doesn't love a good story? Stories and context help us sift through the details of our own lives and decide what meanings to give them. Which details are significant? Which are minor? How do they signify in the broader world? There are many more stories we don't know than we do. History lessons that were drilled into our consciousness in school have been wanting for feminine leaders and perspectives to balance those of men. Foremothers did great things too. I've heard some fascinating anecdotes during this project. One friend who is researching the Statue of Liberty told me that American women were not allowed on Liberty Island during the October 1886 unveiling, though two French women, wife of the statue's designer and the 13-year-old daughter of a French engineer who spoke that day, were permitted to attend the ceremony. Women suffragists from New York chartered a boat which circled the island, shouting speeches and protests that they didn't have liberty to vote, even though Lady Liberty was meant to embody the spirit of the American dream for all. Why have we not heard more stories like this? Another writer friend told a story about growing up in the same western Pennsylvania town where Ida Tarbell lived. She remembers a historic marker in the front of the house, but no one ever told her much of Ida's story. Tarbell had been a journalist, a muckraker, she was called, who exposed John D. Rockefeller's ruthless practices in the oil industry, and her articles led to the Supreme Court's breakup of the Standard Oil monopoly. It seemed that there wasn't any sentiment against Tarbell, but no one found her relevant in the course of considering the other matters of their daily lives in that little town. As we've been gathering stories, it's become clear that the suffragist struggles of 100-plus years ago resonate for many people who draw parallels between that history and more recent battles to gain or keep our rights. As we are becoming more aware that the way forward needs an intersectional approach, those voices bring a modern, more inclusive lens to the ways in which we relate to the past. We sought out a diverse set of voices and viewpoints. including some not heard during the original suffrage movement. These stories and writings in this anthology represent a variety of times, locations, and viewpoints over the last century in New York State. They include non-white and immigrant voices. They include voices of suffragists in the 1900s to those of the 2017 Women's March participants. Here's to our voices and our stories. Stacey Murphy. So, excuse me, I misspoke before. I thought I was reading from Nora Snyder, but I wanted to read from Stacey Murphy. There is another introduction in the book that is written by Nora Snyder as well. This reading we'll be doing is by Lynn Alcott, and it's entitled Ellen Jones. There is a story in the family about my grandmother Ellen Jones during the 1920s, standing before a mirror in her hallway, pinning her hat to a mass of black hair, straightening her shoulders, smiling at her reflection, and going out to vote. She was born in South Wales, came here as a child, married a tall, difficult man, had 4 children in 6 years, all of whom went to college, lived through a botched hysterectomy, cooked and cleaned for a difficult man, who drank and cheated on her, who got very ill, yet she took care of him until she died. Then, in her 70s, she moved to Phoenix, drank a beer in the afternoon now and then, subscribed to a Welsh language newspaper, and all those years she always went out to vote. So you can get a feel for what these readings are like. They're all very different depending on who wrote them. Some are in this form, some are more of a story. Some include some references to historical text or speeches. So they're all really cool. The next one is by Margaret Kearns, and it is entitled The Uphill Struggle. Were you scared, Granddaddy, you wouldn't make a good husband for Edna? I had a lot to learn when I was young, he said, as I sat back in my chair and sipped orange juice. Like what? Figuring out what I believed in, my priorities, and falling in love with Edna. Within the next few minutes, I closed my eyes and remembered Wilmer's advice. It's as important to live inside oneself as it is to live in the outside world. By this, I figured he must have meant that my feelings, dreams, and imagination were as important as my school homework, ballet lessons, and 4-H club sewing group. This idea was the glue in filling in the spaces of my grandfather's storytelling about being a young man, working in New York City at his first job in 1903. I wasn't there. I hadn't been born, even though storytelling doesn't distinguish between time or space or location. Storyteller and listener joined hands on a Sunday afternoon stroll when I, at the age of 10, accompanied my grandfather when visiting the past. The two of us headed toward Battery Park in Lower Manhattan. Hikers enjoying the harbor on weekends included families, courting couples, tourists, and immigrants recently arrived through Ellis Island. On this particular day, a young woman solicited signatures for a petition in support of votes for women. She carried suffrage literature as well as souvenirs for sale to benefit the National American Women's Suffrage Association. When she stood on a bench to deliver a fiery speech on equality and voting rights, the message was directed to Wilmer, me, a matron, and her 2 grandchildren. Several male passers-by shouted in the speaker's direction, "No wonder you're not married." Public speaking about women's rights at the turn of the 20th century was risky. Those expressing public support could be splashed with buckets of water, pelted with rotten eggs, assaulted with tobacco plugs, and given derogatory names including crowing hen, shrieking sister, and worse. Staying out of the limelight had been part of a long-standing tradition for American women who accepted the requirements of being confined at home while men dominated the public arena. This activist had moved boldly into Battery Park to deliver her message to larger numbers of people, even if it involved facing resistance. "Aren't you afraid for your safety?" one man called out as he passed by. "I have every intention of acting like a modern woman, even if some people still prefer the Middle Ages," she responded. Conventional women, with their hands pressed firmly around their husband's elbow, avoided walking too close to the activist. Because of her appearance, most pedestrians seemed to consider her brazen, undignified, and confrontational, unworthy of even a glance in her direction. Wilmer told me the young woman was the most likely to type the bi- was the most likely to type the type to bicycle through Central Park, wearing a shirtwaist frock to be admired by onlookers as tall, thin, nicely proportioned with a small waist and tumbling waterfall of brown curls down her back, elegant and eligible, until she started lecturing about women's suffrage. And that's just a section from this. I didn't want to read the whole thing to you guys. Obviously, they are quite lengthy, some of them, but I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the types of stories. This one is really neat with the memories of the grandfather talking about his past and what he had witnessed as a young man. The next one is by Christine Edwards, and it's entitled Speaking Up. Over the years, I never felt connected to the women's suffrage movement. I never felt I could identify with it. My parents always performed their civic duty by voting in local, state, and national elections, but it ended there. Once in a while, my dad would pipe up with his views, but there was no conversation. There were no lessons within my family to learn about political activism. We didn't talk about politics because it wasn't polite. My activism and political voice have only come to fruition in this past year, in 2016. I had voted before then, but I'm ashamed to say it wasn't a priority. I didn't think my voice really mattered. How could anyone hear my voice in a sea of voices, especially that of a young woman? I know my privilege. I feel it. But what about my voice all those years? Would things have been different if I had been a male? What was it like for women in my family? I visited my grandma, looking for some perspective on the suffrage movement and her voting experience. I was certain this amazing woman would have some insight to share with me. She always does. Her parents and brother immigrated to the United States in 1920. My grandma was born in 1928, and as a first-generation citizen, was the first woman to vote in her family in 1946. She didn't recall any notable stories about voting or the movement, but she did have stories about what her life was like growing up. She said her father was very strict with her, but lenient on her brother. She was treated differently. There was a way things were done, and if you didn't question it, especially if you were a female. I, too, was taught to be quiet. The treatment of females was ingrained in me. It's the only way the world worked, society worked, and religion worked. These teachings that molded me weren't outright oppression, but they were oppressive nonetheless. So I'm going to stop there. There's a little bit more left in this passage. But Christine is talking about her firsthand experience with her family growing up and not discussing the political aspect of the world and her having to find her own voice and recognizing that her voice may or may not be enough. That's the last passage that I'm going to read for you guys. I did want to show you the end of the book. Actually, there's a photograph here, and it's from February 28, 2017. This group of Democratic women wore suffragist white to President Trump's first joint address to Congress to show their unity in fighting any attempt to roll back progress for women during his presidency. And that's from the Office of Congresswoman Chellie Pingree. But on the opposite page, we have about the authors. So if you flip through these back pages, there's a little blurb about each of the authors included in the book, which is really neat too, because you get a little more sense of who they are, other than, just reading their stories, which are also very engaging and creative. So I would highly recommend this book if you are a female. If you're not a female, it's very easy to read through. I got through it pretty quickly. There's some pictures in the text that break it up, which is nice. And like I said, we will be having a live reading on June 10th, 7 p.m. on our Facebook Live. If you would like to purchase the book beforehand, you can do so on an online store. And starting today through June 10th, you can get the book for 10% off its original price of $17.95, and we can get the book out to you as soon as we can. And I just want to say again, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying all the digital programming that HHS has been doing over the past few months. And everybody stay happy, stay healthy, and see you next time.